So we are talking about Christian ethics. So we're moving on from the first chunk, the first 8 weeks. We really were in the area of what we'd consider dogmatic theology. So the dogmas of the church, the teachings of the church. Not to say that these aren't the teachings of the church, but a little more in what we believe. Now we're going to get into, the sacraments and liturgy. We're starting to move in that direction, but how do we practice? How do we live it out? And so this would be called moral theology. So ethics. So when we're talking about ethics, what are we talking about? So there's a slight distinction between ethics and morality. They're very similar, and they're often used interchangeably. But when we talk about ethics, it's more in the philosophical realm. And what are the systems? What are the rules? What are the principles in determining what is right and what is wrong? Morality is dealing specifically with human actions and behavior within those systems or even without. And that's when we start getting into good versus evil. So right and wrong, good and evil. So it's a subtle distinction, but it is there. But this question of goodness and what it is to be good is really the question to ask when we're looking at moral theology and morality. So Christians should not only understand what is good, but do what is good. So we understand what's good, we understand what we believe, and we work to know that, but then actually do it and live that out and be good people and be rewarded for doing that. So it is talking about who we ought to be and how we ought to live. And so there's definitely a connection between knowing what's good and then doing what's good. We have to know what's good in order to do it. So our moral behavior indicates whether or not we have this relationship with God, right? It's the bar. So if you say you believe in God and you have this amazing prayer and faith life, but you're going out and you're extorting people and dealing drugs in the corner, I mean, there's a sense of like, maybe your relationship with God isn't quite there. Right? It's this response to God. It's not just, doing the right things and whatnot. It's a response to God, and it's not just the rules, right? It's not just following rules. It's a relationship that we're developing. So morality is really about how do we form and keep up this relationship with God and by extension, the relationship with other people. And there's two sources for how we know all these things. So we can know by reason. We'll talk about natural law and the ethical systems and whatnot. We know by reason what's good for us and how to act, and also of course by revelation. We'll talk about both of those sources today. So the question to keep in the mind for all of morality, and especially for this, for the rest of tonight, is what is good for man? That's what we're talking about for morality. What is good for man? And by man, of course, I mean human beings. So ethics. It comes from like all these things come from Greek, ethikos, pertaining to character, specifically moral character. We're talking about ethics. And so just to start, what are some of the major ethical systems that we have out there that from, the philosophical and Christian tradition and just in our world. So one is utilitarianism. This is going to be credited in a large way to the philosopher John Stuart Mill. He's a more modern philosopher. And when I say modern, I mean since like the 1600s. So modern in a relative term. So it looks and says that what is good. An action is right insofar as it promotes happiness, and specifically, what's the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. And by extension, what minimizes pain for the greatest number of people. So that's our guiding principle for deciding what is right, what is good, what promotes the happiness for the greatest amount of people. You see that a lot today. You'll see that as far as in some of these ethical systems, it being played out in real time because of because of the pandemic. It's brought a lot of these questions to the surface. All right, another one is called Deontology. This is made very popular or promoted by Immanuel Kant in the 1800s. So it says an action is considered good because of something about the action itself, not because the product of the action is good. So it's not so much as making the man good, but that there's something about that action that is in itself good. So he's very big on, the ends don't justify the means. And it has to be, you can only be considered morally good if you can, picture an action that's always good, right? So you can't lie because you can imagine lying, and, lying will not benefit all people. It's something, but it's about the action itself, not about the end of the action. There's communitarianism, which is about within the rights within a society, responsibility to and the cultural tradition. So is it a good action? Well, is it benefiting the community? Are you being responsible to the community? Are you fulfilling the things of the culture that within your community? Then it's a good action. And then the last two are very connected, and these are certainly the more Christian additions to the ethical systems. So the first is natural law. We'll get into natural law more near the end, but it's looking specifically at the nature of a human being and how we act in accord with that human nature. And so your actions judged, whether it's good or evil, is this in accord with human nature or is it not? All right. So it's really very, very much different from that deontology. It's looking at the end of the action, and is it good? Is it good versus the action itself? And then virtue ethics, about a good person is the one who does virtue, practices virtue. It makes a person good, causes him to perform his function well, to be a good person. He is the virtuous person. That would be virtue ethics. And those last two are pretty connected. And all of these are keep in mind that we are made in God's image. That sense of made in God's image and likeness, created by God, is a cornerstone, a building block for all of morality when it comes to dealing with other humans. So we because we're made in God's image, we have dignity. It's not one that needs to be earned. We have an inherent dignity. We can think, we can reason, we can actually distinguish between good and evil. And with that comes the freedom to choose between good and evil. So we can see the good and we can choose it, or we can see the good and choose the opposite. So we're responsible. We're blameworthy for our actions, right? We'll talk about this a little later, but there's a little bit of a scale, and how responsible are you for your actions? Certain actions comes into play, but again, we have that level of responsibility. There's some sense that we're wounded by sin, and that the ability to do that good, to choose the good, is inhibited in a way by our proclivity to sin. But with that, we are children of God. We're saved. So there's this model of Christ. There's this freeing action of Christ that allows us to choose the good, and that we're friends of God, made in God's image to be friends with Him. So we love Him above all, and our neighbors as ourselves. I mean, that's a basic tenet of Christian morality. We get a lot of these from Greek philosophy. So these are some of the systems that we inherit from the Greeks. And these are very much still in play today. So they very much look as happiness. What will make me happy? If I'm living a happy life, I'm living a morally good life. And so what does that look like for these different guys? So there's a thing of like, you know the thing, and then you do the thing. But depending on the philosopher, you can know it, but you still have to do it. Whereas for a guy like Plato, he says, if you know it, you're automatically going to do it. How true is that? You be the judge. But Aristotle says that Aristotle, I should say, takes what's called a teleological approach. It's teleological because it's aimed at something. Everything is done with some action, some end in mind, right? We don't just do things for no reason, right? Everything we do is done for a purpose, for some purpose. And he looks and he looks around and he sees from human experience what's good. So he looks at all the goods in the world: money, wealth, pleasure, power, friendship, all these things, all these goods, and determines that we do all these things in order to make ourselves, in order to be happy. And man's and he also sees that man's proper function is to reason, right? What separates us from other animals were our ability to reason. So in order to be fully human, in order to be a good human, is to use reason. And how do we use reason? We live virtuously. So he says there's a combination of what makes you happy. You live the virtuous life. You use reason to the best of your ability. There's some good fortune, right? There's people who are born into better conditions. They have, better behaved children or better children. There's people who are better looking than others or more talented. There's some sort of good fortune that goes with it. And then friendship is a very important part for him with happiness. So this is that's Aristotle. So Epicure, he founds this system called Epicureanism. You could also call it hedonism, but it's all about physical pleasure. What's more intense, the better. The good is it's pleasure seeking. Maximize pleasure, minimize pain on an individual basis, right? The minimize pain is almost more important than to maximize pleasure. What can I do to avoid suffering? That's what's good. Living the good life is avoiding suffering at all costs and then seeking pleasure. That's what makes life good and leads me to happiness. The Stoics take almost the opposite approach and they say, well, we see around the world, we can't control external things, so we just need to accept them. We detach from external control, and so we live with a virtuous life, but good fortune, whatever. They say we want to reach this state called apatheia, or we hear the word apathy comes from this. So this clarity, this acceptance of reality. Reality is what it is. I can't change it. And so I'm going to live in the world as it really is. So if you live virtuously and you accept this state that, I'm living in reality, we'll be happy. You'll see some stoicism in St. Paul and his denial of the flesh, denial of the world, acceptance of God's will, things like that. So it's not, he's not purely Stoic, but you can see some Stoic tendencies in St. Paul. Of course, morality is going to involve sin, right? An offense against truth, goodness, reason, God, truly an offense against God and neighbor, right? You want something for your own good without any regard for others. You want it your way and you want it immediately. You don't want to wait for it. And in Hebrew, the word is hatat. In Greek, it's hamartia, and they both mean the same thing: missing the mark, failing to respond. So there's something about sin. You're not quite getting it right. You might have good intentions. You're trying, but you're missing that mark. Of course, we have venial sins and mortal sins. As we go through it, we'll flesh that out. Hopefully, a little more of the things behind it. So the seriousness of the sin. Some sins are more grave than others. The knowledge of that sin. So if you don't know it's a sin, it can't be a mortal sin. And then the freedom that you're truly putting your full will behind it. You're freely choosing that action, despite knowing it's bad and despite having that knowledge of it. So we have this need for grace, absolution, penance. That's very much a part of the moral life. Sin is we have original sin. There's personal sin. There's social sin. I mean, we can look around society. You see social sins. These social sins can lead to even structures of sin where just living in society you're going to almost be committing sin just because the society is structured that way. So think about abortion in the United States. So even though you're not, we're very much against abortion, but there's things about society that are geared towards that, and we work to change that, but it's difficult. Conscience. So in order to determine right from wrong, good from evil, we have this thing called our conscience, right? To be able to judge an act. So judgment, we use our reason to recognize whether something is good or bad, and then we kind of hand that over to our will to say, okay, now you know that it's good or bad, now you do something with it. All right, there's two types of conscience. There's the deep, the ontological, the part of our being, and then there's the practical, where we make our decisions. So the inner sense where God instills himself, the law, as humans, we can know right from wrong based on how God created us. But of course, there's errors in making judgment. So the goal of conscience is to line up practical with deontological, with our decision making, with how would God make these decisions. So we form our conscience in order to be able to do that. So the reason we need to form our conscience is we all have different abilities and predispositions. It's this lifelong task. It's not something that we just do in one day. It's a lifelong task to form it. And it's not just going to happen by accident. There's effort on our part. There's a need to be educated and learn and see. Within this formation of conscience, a human being must always obey the certain judgment of his conscience. He can't act against his conscience, right? You might hear the phrase primacy of conscience. But in doing so, you can't act against your own conscience. You shouldn't. But if your conscience remains in some sort of ignorance and makes erroneous judgments, we need to do something about that. So you follow your conscience, but it can't remain in ignorance. If you want a great example, I don't know if anyone has seen, there's an amazing movie called A Hidden Life. That's all about Blessed Franz Jägerstätter, this guy who was an Austrian farmer, and he refused to take the oath to Hitler in World War II. He's eventually martyred for it. That's why he's a blessed. But it's all about him following his conscience versus how others treat him over that. So if you want a great example of a man following his conscience, and what I would say is a well-formed conscience, I will watch that movie. It's long, but it's well worth your time. It's called A Hidden Life. It's by Terrence Malick movie. All right, so Hebrew scriptures, the ethics in Hebrew. So they come from all over the Hebrew scriptures. Namely, Torah is the place where the law comes from. The moral law and all the law comes from Torah. Torah actually means law in Hebrew. So we learn about God, the universe, man, morality for the individual and the society, all the rights, the customs, the institutions for how we're going to institute the law. And of course, it gives a good history of the people. Abraham Heschel, he's a Jewish rabbi, great scripture scholar, says that the Bible is an answer to the supreme question: what does God demand of us? Right? He wants us to be good, but how is God saying, here's how you be good? It's the antidote to this dogma of self-sufficiency and individualism, very much that rose out of the Enlightenment of human beings can do this on their own. We don't really need anyone else. We don't need God. Human beings are able to do this on our own. That's you look around and see where that's gotten us. And we get the Torah. The Hebrew people got the Torah because God isn't saying, all right, good luck. You exist. Good luck with everything. Hope to see you someday. No, He gives the ability to guide. Right? Here's how you steer themselves. Here's how you steer yourselves. Right? You can find closeness to God, relationship with God. Because for the Hebrews, following the law, being good, was all tied up in righteousness, this term righteousness. And by righteousness, it's right relationship with God. And if you're in right relationship with God, then right relationship with yourself and with your neighbor. So what does it mean to be righteous? What does it mean to be in right relationship with God? And so that's where God hands over the Torah, the law, to the Hebrews. So this tzedakah, righteousness, is this right relationship, the Hebrew word. And within this is given the Shema, the great Shema of, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your soul, all your mind, all your heart. It's repeated all throughout the Old Testament and by Jesus. And then there's this secondary part of loving your neighbor as yourself. So here's all the sources of law in the Torah. Of course, Leviticus is almost exclusively the giving of the law. Sacrifices, feast days, rituals, the holiness, the code, the purity code, all the ritual washings, all the sacrifices that need to be offered, how those sacrifices need to be offered. The Deuteronomy adds in some of the more civil laws, how you treat your neighbor, how you live in society. So here's where we get all these. There's where we get all these things. Big one, it would be the 10 Commandments. That's one of the part of the moral code that we as Christians take and have adopted in our own tradition. So I could go into depth. I could spend a whole hour talking just about the 10 Commandments. I won't do that to you. But here's we are. We're hopefully familiar with the 10 Commandments. This is kind of the minimal thing. Here's the minimal way of how to be a good person, or at least a moral person, an ethical person, is you follow the 10 Commandments. But it is by no means it's not going to necessarily lead to flourishing or the ultimate good, but it's the good basis to found an ethical system on. This fourth commandment is called the hinge commandment. It's honoring your father and mother, because the father and mother were seen as God's representatives on earth for the child as they brought them up. So the first three are about God and honoring God. The second, from 5 to 10 is this dealing with other people. And this fourth, the hinge commandment of going between the two. But there's not just 10 commandments in the Hebrew scriptures. There's 613 commandments that cover everything from sexual relationships, all how to proceed in judiciary causes, all the ceremonies, agricultural practices, all the kosher and food laws. Right? They use this word mitzvah, meaning commandment. Think about a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah, the son of the commandments. So at a bar mitzvah, the boy, when he turns 13, he would be reading from the Torah. So the ethics in the Torah, they don't just, again, pop out of nowhere. There's a revelation from God, a guidance by God, but also influence from the surrounding cultures. That they're living with the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Persians and the Egyptians, these nomadic tribes that are coming through, and they're being influenced. So their codes and how they live is coloring how the Hebrews are living ethically. So they've compared the 613 commandments with some of the other codes that were out there. So you may have heard of Hammurabi's code. I think that was for the Babylonians, in one of the ancient Mideast cultures. And there's similarities there. The commandments are governing all aspects of human life. There's no separation of church and state. But living a good religious life was the same as living a good citizen, right? They're all connected, right? You're a good person. You're a good follower of God. And so we have all these prescriptions, all these things to uphold peace and stability within the tribes, right? This is more than just the Torah. This is all, right? You want peace and stability. The same way, one of the reasons we have laws today. And of course, they have a lot of the understanding of how demons, evil spirits, good spirits were at work in the world, and then combine that with aspects of physical wellness or wealth or flourishing. Right? You do what God commands, and you're going to be healthy, and you're going to be rich, or it's a sign of that, right? If sin was, if you were born blind, you remember the question of, whose sin is his sin or his father's sin, right? That's very much part of their. It of course sounds strange for us today, but that was very much a part of their thing. So it's a context of these ethics, and they're very much within the community. The Hebrew people are very social people, right? It's about relationship, all about relationship. Covenant is the key word. Is covenantal relationship with God, and when you're in that relationship with God, you're also in relation with your neighbor. So the righteous one, the good one, the one who lives a good life, is the one who lives according to the commandments in relation to everyone who's around him. Right? This memory, I remember what God has done for me, and I live that out. The Greeks are much more on the personalized individual level with virtue. Right? They're both. They're both. It's not to say one is better than the other, but there's just different focuses, and Christianity kind of adopts both of these. There is this preferential option for the poor, and this is something that we'll cover a little more next time with social justice and Catholic social teaching. But all throughout the Torah, we see, you see here 36 times, don't oppress or harm foreigners. You were once aliens yourselves in the land of Egypt. And you remember when you were aliens and what it was like to be that. So in the same way, remember this, and don't treat widows, orphans, foreigners, the poor in a bad way. And hospitality is this key value in these cultures. You've seen that borne out in the Chosen. So it's not just the Torah. The Torah is a huge source, but the prophets also give us some of the ethics, right? So they're very much, looking at justice. So they see injustice in society. They see them forgetting God's promises, forgetting God's actions, trying to domesticate God, enclose him within the temple, and we can control God. And the prophets are there to remind them, hey, this is not what it is. God freed you from slavery and brought you to the promised land, so we should live according to his law. Remember this. So there's an admonishment of the people to follow it. To, you think you're being good, but you're not. You need to follow God's covenant. That's how you're good. And there's also the wisdom literature. So the Psalms, the Proverbs, Job, for some reason I have listed here twice. So really look at Job. But there's all these parables for how to do this, right? There's many times, happiest are they, blessed are they who do these things, who follow, there's a bunch of things in the answer. It's not just for right from wrong, but how do you be a good person? What does a good person look like? What does a happy person look like? For example, Psalm 19 says, the law of the Lord is perfect, refreshing the soul. It's trustworthy. It gives us wisdom. It brings us rejoicing of the heart, right? It's more desirable than anything. So we follow, it's pointing to follow the law. It's going to bring you not just the ability to choose right from wrong, but to actually be happy and be good. So this flows right into Christian scriptures, specifically Jesus. So we hear what's the first and greatest of all the commandments, and he gives us the Shema. There it is. The Lord your God is our Lord alone. Love your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. And then here's this Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus just picks up right where the Hebrew scriptures left off. But then he of course goes above and beyond this supererogation, to go above, to pay more than what is due. So ergare is this, paying, giving what is due. Super is, above, this notion of beyond. So going beyond what's required by the law. So I've come to not abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. So think of the Good Samaritan. All those, the priest, the Levite, the people who pass the Good Samaritan are following the law. They're following, they don't want to, make themselves impure. They're going to the temple, all these things. It's the Samaritan. We don't interact with them. But there's the Samaritan one's the one who goes above and beyond the law. He doesn't violate the law, but he's this. We need to go above what is just required. So it's not just what's in the rules, but what is the rule pointing to? So the Sermon on the Mount, we get this, you've heard it, we read this again and again. You've heard it said, do not commit adultery, right? Yes, accurate. But I say to you, if a man looks with lust upon a woman, he's already committed adultery in his heart. So it's above and beyond the law, but it's pointing to what is, if you're doing this, it's not good for you. It's not going to be in your best interest. It's not helping you flourish. You shall not murder. Again, yes, good. Don't murder people. But I say to you, if you think evil thoughts in your heart against your brother, you've murdered him in your heart. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. I mean, Hammurabi's code right there, right into the Torah. I say to you, turn the other cheek. Give your cloak to the one who needs it. Don't go just 1 mile, go 2 miles. Don't hate your enemies. You've heard it said that you should hate your enemies and love those who do good to you. Very reasonable. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. All in the Sermon on the Mount. Side note, I'm very excited to see this in the Chosen, the Sermon on the Mount. Should be very good. And it's the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount that he's pointing to this flourishing. What is good for man? It's not just, the Ten Commandments, a good foundation, but how do we go above and beyond? Well, we try to be poor in spirit. We mourn, we're humble, we thirst for righteousness. We're merciful, we're pure of heart, we're peacemakers. We're not afraid to be persecuted for being righteous, for being in this right relationship. The path to being in a right relationship, the path to goodness is in the Beatitudes. So again, he says, blessed are they. Who are the blessed? It's the Makarios. They're the ones who are most favored by God. So that's the word that's for blessed that's used in Matthew chapter 5. Makarios. They're the most favored by God. They're living the best human life. They're the ones who are the ones full of grace, the ones most desirable, who are living the best human lives, the most desirable of human lives. That's them. And so Jesus is saying, if you live the Beatitudes, you'll live happier, more fulfilled human lives here on earth. And then it all points to heaven. It's all pointing ahead to heaven. And so he's giving them this new way, right? That I mentioned this before in an earlier topic, but earliest disciples they weren't necessarily called Christians, but the followers of the way. And Jesus gives this new way to act. It's not just an abstract framework. He's not just saying, do this and you'll be fine. Here's all the rules. He shows them this way. He models it. Be imitators of me as I'm an imitator of Christ. And as Christ has showed, because Christ didn't just come down and give us a bunch of rules. He lived it out. Every one of his, go above and beyond, he does it. Culminates in the cross. Right? This is a core belief for Christianity, that it's not just, here's how you live. Right? It's a lot of other religious traditions, and that's fine. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but God shows, here's how you do it. Here's a model of how it should look. If you remember that this was very popular in the 90s, WWJD, everyone had a bracelet. It was more of a fashion statement than a actual, where people have to be doing this. So, it's kind of like the Livestrong bracelets. But it's, again, there's something true about it. What would Jesus do? Because he did model it for us. And he provides this, first and foremost, this servant mentality, which Pope Francis really demonstrates well. Not to say that other popes didn't demonstrate this, but Pope Francis has, he's really based his pontificate very much on showing this servant mentality. The last shall be first. Whoever wishes to be great among you shall be his servant. Wash the feet of others. As I have done for you, so you must also do. Deny yourself, take up your cross, liberate yourself from possessions, right? In the story of the rich young man is really the fulfillment of the Shema, right? The rich young man comes up and says, I want to get to heaven. What should I do? And Jesus says, well, follow the Shema and love your neighbor as yourself. And he says, I'm doing that. And he says, okay, here's how you go above and beyond. Sell what you have, give it to the poor, follow me. And of course, he's unwilling to do that, goes away sad. But it's above and beyond. Give up your possessions, leave behind possessions. It comes up again and again and again. And not that possessions are bad, but it's, what is your relationship with possessions? Right relationship with possessions is not the same as a right relationship with God. And St. Paul takes, of course, the gospel and the teachings of Christ and expounds upon them. He is all about community as well, this social aspect. Life happens in a community. Exhort each other, imitate me as I did of Christ. Look at the people who are being Christ-like, imitate them. Right? Put aside this vicious behavior. He's not rejecting the law. He's saying it's the law is pointing to how to behave, but we also have Christ as fulfilling the law. Right? It's in this light of faith and entrusting yourself to God, being in good relationship, this new birth, a new creation. You can act in a new way because you've been created as a new person. He gives us all these fruits of the Holy Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, all these. They're later given as virtues. So the Hebrew scriptures flow into the Christian scriptures, and then those are developed by these great Christian thinkers. We're going to focus on, well, one today, but I will mention another one here. So first, St. Augustine. Hopefully you've heard the story of St. Augustine. If not, read the Confessions. But you'll know he was kind of a debaucherous young man. He went around seeking pleasures and trying to find the system that fit him well. He spends time with the Manichaeans. This play out of light versus darkness, good versus evil. They're equal. They're battling out. But he eventually comes back and accepts Christianity and becomes one of the greatest Christian thinkers of all time. And he's very influential in developing the theory of original sin and how that affects us, and some sort of systematizing of Christian ethics that's picked up by the guy we're going to talk about in a sec. So Augustinian anthropology it's a pretty negative anthropology in the sense that it sees humans as very beneath God, and very, there's not a lot that we can do to be good, right? It's not quite Luther, right? Luther's got an even more negative anthropology, but we know that Luther was an Augustinian priest before he went and did his whole thing. So St. Augustine, excuse me, he says that all human beings have this division within their hearts. They desire what is good and lovable and of God, but they have this tendency to choose sin, to choose not God, to be self-centered, to be lustful, greedy, malicious. And that the sinfulness is this turning away from God and elevating our own desires above the desire to seek God. It's a great definition of sin I would still use today. All human beings are tainted by pride, and we suffer from this effect of original sin. So he's one of the first to say there's this thing that we've inherited as part of being human, that just is part of us. Baptism frees us from it, of course. It's not, we don't have it forever, but we can be washed of this original sin. But there's the effects of it are very much in our lives. And there's this internal tension. And it causes division within ourself and division within society. So Augustine is the popular one, there's others, but Augustine is very popular for a long time, and his ethics are developed. But there's one guy who really contributes to all areas of theology, but morality in a very unique and amazing way that we still use a lot today. And of course, that is St. Thomas Aquinas, the angelic doctor himself. So he was born in Italy. He's a Dominican, incredible writer. He writes and writes and writes and writes. He died when he was, in his 50s or 60s, and he eventually just stopped writing. He considered everything he wrote straw and compared to God, which is incredible, because what he wrote was so we still use so much of it today, right? His greatest work being the Summa Theologiae, the summary of theology, this collection of theology. And his main thing is do good, avoid evil. And that's the core of natural law that we'll get to later. So do good, avoid evil is the cornerstone of his moral outlook. So the Summa Theologiae can be broken into three parts. The prima pars, the first part is all about God and creation. How do we know God? We talked about some of this that first session when we talked about God and who God is. The second part is all about human acts and morality. That's what we'll get into. And then the third part is all about Christ and the sacraments, which we covered a little bit 2 weeks ago. So Aquinas reintroduces, in a way, baptizes the philosophy of Aristotle. He's the one who really takes it up. Aristotle had kind of been thrown on the back burner, disregarded, that's not really what we want to use. Aquinas brings it back up and starts to use it and use it to bolster all his theology and his explanation. But he brings back into the forefront teleology. Things are pointing towards something, right? Everything, reality in general, human nature in particular, acts towards some end. It's not just willy-nilly. There's some purpose that it's driving towards. The telos is the target, the thing that we're aimed at. This great Thomistic thinker called Etienne Gilson, he says that the whole universe of Thomas, is all his thought is saturated with finality, with purpose, with what we're aimed at. And it's very true. It's a great insight by Gilson. So the human life is goal-oriented towards flourishing in this life and reuniting with God in the next. There's, in a sense, a little bit of that Baltimore Catechism definition, if you're familiar with that. But it's not just to doing the minimum, doing what enough to get by, but towards flourishing in this life by acting in accord with our nature and reuniting with God in the next, and then bringing that into fullness. And he takes Aristotle's ethics. He takes a lot of things from Aristotle, but his ethics are very much laid out. Aristotle's in the Nicomachean Ethics. If you ever have a chance to read that, that's all good stuff. There's a great section in there about friendship, if you ever want to read it, but all his ethics. So this teleology, humanity's ultimate end. The ultimate end is God, right? And Aquinas says it himself. Everything's aimed at God. It finds its end in God. So while Augustine would say, what must I do? Who must I obey? Aquinas says he wants, what should I do to be happy? What's the path? So he picks up this sense of happiness, but he sees it where Aristotle didn't, in God. Aristotle saw it right in virtue and good fortune and friendship. Aquinas says, yes, all those things are true, right? Virtue's good, friendship's good, good fortune, but God is the ultimate happiness. And we can't be ultimately happy until we're with him and in heaven, experiencing the beatific vision. So all the things, how we make decisions, how we determine good versus evil, how we do good and avoid evil, is aiming ourselves towards God. It's all pointed towards God. We're created by God for God, and that's how we do it. So just as to show how the Summa is set up, it's pretty brilliant, actually. He always starts off by asking some sort of question. This is how the whole Summa looks like, by the way. He asks some question. So, whether man's happiness consists in wealth. So he starts out with objections to what his ultimate point is going to be. So he says, yes, it seems that man's happiness is in wealth, right? And he gives some evidence from other philosophers here, the philosopher Boethius, right? And so he says here, it seems that this is true. But then he says, sed contra. On the contrary, on the other hand, right, man's good consists in retaining happiness rather than spreading it. So it's actually not wealth. And so then he gives his answer, and then he replies to all the objections. So he's saying, what are the best ways to say that this is true, to say that my thing is false. He's almost arguing against himself and arguing with and dialoguing with the great thinkers of time. So he's dialoguing with these thinkers. So particularly Augustine and Aristotle, they're used a lot. St. Paul, certainly, I don't have them listed here, but St. Paul's used a ton. But Gregory the Great, Dionysius, he's a philosopher. Cicero, not even a Christian. St. Jerome, St. John of Damascus, St. Ambrose, he's providing their thought, and he's, how would they think about these things? How would they answer? He's dialoguing with them, even though they're all dead when he writes the Summa. And so he brings in this sense of, what is, the goodness of an act. So individual moral acts are always part of some common good. And that common good being this teleology, this aim towards God. And we cultivate these habits. If we continually choose the good and we do the good, we're going to develop virtue. And so what makes an act morally good? So the act is morally good. It requires three things. The act itself needs to be morally good or indifferent. So it can't be intrinsically, what we call intrinsically evil. It's enacted for the right intention. So, you can't do the good thing for the wrong reason. And it's done, there's circumstances that often apply to these acts. And those can also see if can affect goodness. All right, so this moral object, this is a very important point in Christian morality. All right, so the morality of the human acts, again, we get this right from Aquinas. The object chosen, the end in view, or what we say is the intention, and all the circumstances around it. So these make up the sources, right? How do we determine whether an act is good or bad? It's all these three things put together: the physical action, the proximate end, or the intention, what we're looking for, and then any relevant circumstances. And all these things together, we put them together, and we call that's the moral object, and that's what we use. We evaluate that moral object to determine whether it's good or bad. Right? So this moral object is what we're choosing to do or choosing to not do. That's what the choice is around. We order it by reason. We use reason to recognize and judge whether it's in conformity with our good. The morality of the human act depends on this object being chose by the will. The will, we choose it with our will after we evaluate its moral goodness with the whole object. But this is very important. You can't use just the intention or the circumstances by themselves to be the ultimate standard by which morality is judged. So we can't just say it had good intentions, and so it's fine, right? Or there's circumstances, but that wiped it, we're fine. It might have been bad, but there's circumstances that made it good, right? Intention and circumstance are incapable of making an immoral action into a moral one when the object of an action is intrinsically evil. So let's look at a few examples. All right, so here are some, again, here's the moral object, the physical description, the physical action, that what we're doing, the intended end, why we're doing it, and then maybe some circumstances. All right, so for example, you swallow a morphine pill, you take a morphine pill. Is that it's not a morally, an intrinsically evil thing, right? It's a morally good or morally indifferent act, right, by itself. So if we're doing that, and our intended aim is to alleviate some pain we have, right? We just had surgery. We actually have pain. That's the circumstances. We just got out of surgery and we have pain. We want to alleviate pain. But if we don't have pain and we're just doing it to get some sort of high, look at the opioid epidemic right now in the United States, right? That's where we take this whole thing and we say that is a morally evil thing. Taking this physical thing, but it's got the wrong intention. Right, so these stars here, the asterisks, are where reason is violated. So birth control, taking birth control is in itself not necessarily an intrinsically evil act. And sorry, let me change this to just avoid confusion because I forgot to change that for the first one. This should be conception, not avoiding contraception. That makes no sense. All right. So if a woman takes birth control to prevent this disease, endometriosis, and they actually have the disease, right? That's a morally neutral act. It's not that she's not doing something evil there. But if she's taking birth control to avoid conception and she's married, then yeah, it's a morally evil act. Right? You can see how we take this whole thing. Right? I'm going to skip over the experimentation one just for the sake of time. Right? Drinking alcohol. Right? Not a intrinsically evil thing, right? The monks make beer and alcohol. So we do it to socialize, to have fun. Okay. If I'm socializing and having fun, but I'm like, okay, I don't really care if I get drunk or I'm planning on getting drunk or whatnot. Okay. Our circumstances are making this into an evil act. If I'm drinking it, I want to get drunk. I'm doing it. I'm going to drink to the point of drunkenness. Again, that's where we're moving into that evil act. All right. Shooting someone. Doing it in the case of capital punishment, doing it in self-defense, right? If that's the intended end, then it's maybe not morally good, but it's allowable. It's not morally evil. But if I'm doing it as a means, like homicide, if I'm trying to gain something from shooting someone and killing them, that's when it becomes a moral evil. Or if I'm shooting, if I'm doing it capital punishment, but I know he's innocent. I know the guy's innocent, but I still do it anyway. Okay, now the circumstances made this into a moral evil. Or in self-defense, like, I could have used lesser force, right? Again, that's where we're getting into the moral evil. Here's an example of the intentions not making a intrinsically evil act bad. So abortion, an intrinsically evil act, killing a baby in utero. So even if you want to, you're doing it for the right intentions, right? You're poor and you can't afford a baby. The mother's life is in danger. You want to live your life, as you want it, right? The last one's not I wouldn't call that a good intention, but the other one's great intentions, right? They're, you say that's, yes, I respect that, but it doesn't make abortion good just because you have those good intentions. So that's the moral object. It's a key thing to understand when looking at morality. So he says, Aquinas does say there's actions that are intrinsically evil due to the nature of the act itself. Lying. Now, there's a lot to say about lying that I don't have time to now, but there's been a lot of talk about it. So could you lie? That the Nazis are coming in and asking if you're hiding any Jews in your house. Can you lie to them? Well, there's some theologians who say no, you can't even do that. There's a lot who would say, well, yeah, it changes it. So, well, does that make it intrinsically evil? Not. It's an interesting discussion that we don't have time for, unfortunately. Maybe another time. So he says sin is this individual agent is involved. He's choosing this evil act. He voluntarily engages. He's willfully choosing it. And it can be for, out of ignorance, in passion, maliciously. The will is very much involved. The will may be understood simply as the power or faculty of the soul by which a human agent is in control of his or her actions. So it's not the intellect, which is how we know, or the memory, which remembers, or the imagination, which conceives, but this is how we control. This is that we know the good and then we do the good. He also goes in a lot in the Segunda Pars, the second part, about virtue, and he very much picks up right where Aristotle left off, where the virtue is the virtuous mean between two vices. All right, so take cowardice, or take courage. The virtue of courage is a mean somewhere between recklessness. You're not being courageous, you're actually being reckless, and cowardice. So the courage falls somewhere in between those two vices. But it's virtue. Virtue is not just having the virtue; it's doing it. It's doing it intentionally, and that's how you build the virtue, is you do these intentional acts. And to learn how to live virtuously, there's some sort of training or model. Like Aristotle would say, you look to the wise man and the polis. Look to the person who has the virtue and imitate him. And Aquinas says, yes, that's good. And then he would say, who's the ultimate one? Aquinas would, of course, say Jesus Christ. He gives the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity given to us at baptism. These are the ones that aren't the mean. You can't have too much faith, hope, or charity. He also gives the cardinal virtues: justice, prudence, temperance, fortitude. And then talks a lot about the moral virtues. And they're connected in a way to the cardinal virtues, but courage and that's fortitude. But there's different moral virtues that we form by habit. So theological virtues are instilled in us. Moral virtues are we form them by doing them, by habitually living. You act good and you become good. So there is a sense in Aquinas and from Aristotle of, like, fake it till you make it. So even if you maybe you're not virtuous, you're learning to be virtuous, you do the thing, and then eventually you're gonna do it. He also looks at the law. He says there's 4 types of law. There's this eternal law, and that's God himself. Who God is the law, and the way, true goodness itself. There's the divine law, which is the law revealed to human beings. So the 10 Commandments, the Beatitudes, what we actually get from Revelation. There's natural law. We'll get that into a sec of how things are ordered according to God. And there's the positive laws, or the civil laws, or the human laws. Human laws are in order to judge a human law or to have a human law, it needs to be come from reason. It has to be for the common good. It has to be made not just by anyone, but for someone who's, you know, in power and has care for the community, and it's propagated. It's not just it's not hidden away. The law is, you know, it's posted. It's known. There is an exception, if you will, to human law. It's called epikeia. It points to the fullness of law. So, example of this: your wife's pregnant. She goes into labor. You have to drive her to the hospital. It's at night. You come to a red light. There's no one around, and you really need to get to the hospital. But you come to this red light. There's no one around, no pedestrians, no traffic. Can you go through the red light? The answer is yes. With this idea of epikeia, it's, you know, the law can't prescribe every single possible thing, and so it's the fullness of law, right? That the intention of the law, what the law is there for. There's just an aside. There's this really annoying light next to Mundelein that it's one of those where there's a green arrow and a red arrow, and the red arrow stays red forever. And there's oftentimes like no one around, and it's brutal. And so sometimes we come to it and there's no traffic around, there's no pedestrians, and we just go right through it, and we scream at the top of our lungs, epikeia, and we go through, and that makes it all right. And I mean, it doesn't make it all right. Yeah, and it's in the sense of this fullness of the law. We've done this with our moral theology professor, who's a priest in the car, and he's the one who told us that we can do it. So it's okay. Right, every part of morality can't be put into the law. You can't get anything, and sometimes you don't want to put every part into human law. Like, think about prohibition. That was kind of a disaster, but it was trying to instill morality, trying to put morality into law, but it turned out to be not quite great. So for human law to be just, yes, it can't contradict eternal, divine, or natural law. So we already think of some laws in the United States that do this. It's not a just law because it contradicts eternal or divine law or natural law. It must be promulgated. It's not a just law if the law is on the books, but no one knows that it's there. It must be issued by a legitimate authority, right? The government or someone in charge, and it has to serve the common good. Again, we can think of places where this is violated in our society. An unjust law is no law at all. That's Aquinas. So, as we start to wrap up here, just go into natural law. So, natural law is the bedrock of Christian morality, and how we are to act, and how we point towards fulfillment and choosing the good and being good. That question, what's good for man? Following natural law is the answer. It's teleology. It's based on human nature. Humans were designed by God to act in a certain way and to be a certain way and to strive for certain things, right? They weren't just, again, it wasn't just an accident, but it's pointed towards something. So the universe is ordered in a certain way. There's certain states of being that are knowably, objectively better or worse, right? And we experience this. We see that there's better ways to live than others that lead to more flourishing than others, right? It's participation in the eternal law through the gift of reason. God, the reason is the light of God present in man, right? The law in the Old Testament describing the law written on our hearts. That's in Ezekiel, that's in Jeremiah. The law written on our hearts, that's natural law. And it's not the law of nature, right? Natural law points to the concept of human nature, the way human beings are, not like we look out in nature and we see how things behave in nature, and that's how we do it. So we look at the monkeys constantly eating and acting crazy and flinging poop at each other. We're like, well, that's, they're following their urges. That's the law of nature, and that's how we can do it because it's out there. No, that's not what natural law is. People can get confused easily. It's all about human nature and how humans are designed. So they're basic goods, proper to what humans are. Action follows being, right? Who we are, what we do follows who we are, what our nature says we are. So what's essential to being human? They're not subjective, but there's an objective good that our reason tells us is there. What's good for human beings, ordered to how we are designed, and very much related to the virtues. So the way our life, our health, how do we point towards the good in our health and life and knowledge? So the person who seeks to live the good life, which is the person is seeking to live the good life, and it's developing this communion with others and with God. We're affirming the goodness of how God created us. So the principles are, preservation of, good, where we're preserving our life, we're propagating human life, living in society, this communal aspect. We're living what's truth. We're living justly. We're living beautifully. We're letting the truth shine forth. So this is going to be how you live good, how you flourish, is doing these things. That's the natural law. Right? Natural law is present in the heart of each man. It's there. It's universal. Right? It expresses that dignity that created in the likeness of God. Expresses the dignity of the persons and determines the basis of his rights and desires. So we get the life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. That comes from natural law. It can vary in how we apply it, especially from culture to culture, different places, time, circumstances. But regardless of this diversity of culture, human nature is human nature. It's something that binds all men together, right? Human beings, whether we live in 21st century America or 17th century China, we're still human beings, and we're designed to work in a certain way, despite our cultures being different. So it's going to live out and look a little different applied, but it still binds us. There's these common things that bind us. So just a few things, I'll say since Aquinas, but some things to keep in mind. There's this system called casuistry, which really looks at, it was used a lot in the church up until the mid 20th century, and there's still pieces of it around today. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not ideal. It's where morality and good and judging good and bad was based on these manuals and these cases. So here's all these cases. That's where you get the word casuistry from. And it's there's a law, and you have your conscience, and your conscience is, there's an obedience between the conscience and the law. And here's a law, follow it. So it made things very easy in the confessional. Here's the right from wrong. It was easy to judge what was good and what was bad. But it was also legalistic. It was minimalistic. We didn't look at flourishing. It just looked at the minimum. Is this right or wrong? And the action was divorced from the person acting. It was looking at the action itself instead of the acting person. It wasn't really looking at that moral object. The reaction to this was called proportionalism or consequentialism, and it does this thing that we can't do, where it focuses just on the intention and responsibility based on that intention. So if you have a good intention, well, then it's an okay act, right? We saw that you can't make a bad action, an intrinsically bad action, good just based on your intention. So it's good in the sense that it brings the human person back in there. It says intention certainly has a role to play, no doubt, but it can be prone to relativism and towards us justifying bad actions with good intentions. The principle of double effect is very important, especially when it comes to things like self-defense and medical ethics. So in order for it, you can do something, right? You can do an evil or something. You can do an evil provided that it's done for a good purpose. It's doing a bad thing for a good effect to come around. So the act is good or indifferent, meaning it's not intrinsically evil, right? The intention is for the good effect only. You can't say, you say, well, this bad thing might happen, but we're not intending that bad action. We want the good thing to happen. So, for example, amputation of an infected foot. It's an evil for your leg to cut off, right? That's not a good thing. That's an evil thing. There's going to be a lack there. but we're doing it to save your life, to heal you. So the intention is to heal. If the intention was to also, well, you're gonna look, really cool. You can have like this. You want a peg leg, so you're gonna disfigure yourself. I don't know, right? That's bad intention. So the good effect is not, the third one is part of this, is the good effect is not brought about by evil means. So I can't do something evil, intrinsically evil, to bring about the good effect. And there's this balance between the good and the bad effect. So, your toe is causing you a little bit of pain. You stubbed it, right? Well, you can't say, well, my toe hurts, I'm going to cut off my leg so it can't cause me any more pain, right? There's not a good reason for the, to do the bad thing to allow this good effect. There's not a balance there. And also, when it comes to responsibility, we can look at voluntary versus involuntary versus non-voluntary actions. So our responsibility can be heightened or lessened based on these things. A non-voluntary action is something just like bad luck, right? We do something, but it's completely outside of our control. Voluntary is, fully our will's there. Involuntary is kind of the interesting, where, the gray areas can start popping up, like things like addiction and whatnot. So with that, there can be maybe an inattention where we're not all there, and we do something bad. So we should have been paying better attention, but we didn't, right? There's a lessening of responsibility. Just a plain old errors in judgment. And then this ignorance. And if we don't know it, then, it's harder to be held responsible if we don't know it. But within ignorance, there's differences in ignorance. There's vincible versus invincible ignorance. Invincible ignorance is like, I could never have known. I just, there's no way I could have reasonably known that this thing was bad. Vincible ignorance is, I should have known, but I didn't. So if I get pulled over for a cop for speeding, and I tell him, well, I didn't see, I was going 50 miles per hour in a 30 zone. Like, well, I didn't actually see the sign, so I just didn't know. Well, the cop was going to say, well, you should have known. You should have seen the sign. It was there, right? So that would be vincible ignorance, an example. And then finally, this is, I think, very interesting when it comes to the vaccine, the COVID-19 vaccine, and our cooperation of evil. You may have heard this being discussed by the bishops and by the Vatican. So how are we cooperating with evil in the case of the COVID-19 vaccine? So we know that for example, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines were tested on cell lines that came from aborted fetuses, right, in the 70s or 80s or something like that, right? These lines that were derived from there. And so, can we morally receive the vaccine? It's a good question, right? Can we morally receive this vaccine, or are we in some way participating in abortion if we this great evil if we do it? So with this, the principal agent is the one who does the action. The cooperator is the one who's assisting this evildoer in some way, right? So I'll take the example of abortion because it's relevant here. All right, so the principal agent is the doctor who's actually doing the abortion. That's the principal agent. Someone who's assisting him would be a cooperator, and assisting him in a number of ways. So if you're actually intending the immoral act to occur, so you're helping him, you're in the operating room with him, and you're helping with the procedure, and you're intending for this abortion to go through, then you are a formal cooperator with evil, and you are equally guilty with the person doing the act. You might as well have done it. You're equally guilty of the immoral act. But say you didn't intend the immoral act to occur. This is called material cooperation, and then we further need to break it down. All right, so if we're materially, there we go, cooperating, right? Is it immediate or mediate? If it's immediate cooperation, immediate material cooperation, that means that I'm providing the material that is necessary for the immoral act to occur. So I'm not intending the abortion, but I'm working for a company, and we're the company that makes the abortion drugs. Okay, right? I'm guilty of the act, so I'm giving the part that's necessary for the immoral act to occur. So I'm guilty of the immoral act. If I'm providing material that's not necessary for the immoral act to occur, well, then we need to dig down further. So say I own the building that Planned Parenthood, the abortion facility is in, or I make the chairs that are in the waiting room, or I make the bench, I make medical benches, right? Then, well, okay, then we can't say, we don't know if you're guilty or not. We need to drill down further. So I'm immediate material cooperator with evil. Am I guilty of the act? If I make a contribution to the act that leads to the commission of the act, then I am also guilty of this immoral act. So say I'm donating to Planned Parenthood directly, or there's something that I'm doing is contributing to the act. Okay, then I'm guilty of the immoral act. Now, remote mediate material cooperation. This is where the vaccine fits in right here. So making a contribution to the act, it does not lead to the commission of the act. So using these vaccines that were tested on aborted fetal cell lines, right? I mean, doing that, I'm not making any contribution to abortions that are happening today, right? The abortions being committed are not connected with there. It's still not good that this was used, right? There's still a connection with evil, but I'm not doing this, right? The same with, I buy from Amazon or I buy from Starbucks, right? And some of their funds are going to Planned Parenthood. Again, there's a remote material cooperation. So I'm not guilty, but when there's a serious proportion or there's a reason for that I am doing this thing. So for in this case, there's a very good reason for receiving the vaccine to curb the pandemic, to promote public health, right? That's a good reason for getting this vaccine, even though there is an immoral act that connected with it, right? That's why they're comparing the two vaccines, right? The Moderna and the Pfizer versus the Johnson & Johnson, which has, it was developed using these lines. So that's the difference. Now, so I should, if I can, get one of those two vaccines. Now, if there's no options, if I can only get the Johnson & Johnson one, then again, I'm able to do that through remote mediate material cooperation, remote material cooperation. There's not another option for me to do it. And the reason, again, the reason is good, to help stop the pandemic. All right, there we go. Yeah, I knew I went over by a lot. We did start it was like 7:10 when we started. So, all right, I'll give myself a little break. All right, so next week we'll extend this talking about ethics into Catholic social teaching.